Hello, everyone. I'm Doris McMillon, and welcome to Episode 4 of Virtually Speaking. Today, we're talking to William Lewis Jr., Class of 74, Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. Bill, welcome, and thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bill, how did you first hear about A Better Chance?
I first heard about A Better Chance in 1968, 1969 when I was in middle school. We had a series of guidance counselors and teachers who were very familiar with what were called preparatory schools or prep schools, if you will. And we'd had a number of kids who had been recruited by A Better Chance, ABC. And so on an annual basis, the kids would come back and talk to us about their experiences in boarding schools, mainly in the North, and a number of us were typically rounded up to go hear about those experiences and to hear about A Better Chance.
You're from Richmond, Virginia. What was the thought in your mind about leaving Richmond to go north?
Well, I've thought about why I decided to leave Richmond and to leave Richmond at that time a lot. To provide some context, Richmond was a battleground city. Virginia was a battleground state for the fight against segregation. One of the 5 cases that embodied Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 occurred in Virginia. As you know, Thurgood Marshall won that fight in 1954, but it was met by massive resistance over the next 15 or 20 years throughout the South, and Virginia was no exception. As it turns out, 1970 was the year that Virginia finally threw in the towel and agreed to begin to integrate the schools. But that was also the year when I had been accepted to Andover. So I had to think through whether or not I wanted to be a part of a great experiment or whether or not I wanted to move on and try something that was less experimental in a lot of ways. Richmond was becoming, around that time, an incredibly dangerous city. During the 70s and the early 80s, Richmond led the country. It led places like Detroit and Camden, New Jersey, and others in terms of per capita murder rates. And so this was a very convenient way for me to get out of that environment as well.
How did your parents feel about letting their son go away like this?
Well, that wasn't much of an issue. It was a small issue for my father, but my parents were very much working class. My father was a roofer. My mother was what they called in the South a domestic, what they called in the North a maid. They both were incredibly hopeful that their kids would see a better way, if you will. My father put up some initial resistance as it relates to me leaving. My mother carried the day and basically said, if these teachers and guidance counselors, all of whom are very well educated, believe that this is what's best for William Jr., which is what I was known until I went away to the North, then who are we to stand in the way?
Was it a scary kind of situation, or you just were very focused and knew that leaving was going to be life-changing for you?
It was not scary. As I've often said to people, the notion of heading off to a 500-acre campus with lush green grass and playing fields and dedicated buildings to specific courses was not exactly what I would consider fearful. So it wasn't scary. I hadn't given a lot of thought at age 13 or 14 as to sort of what the rest of my life was going to be, but education had always been the foundation for thinking about a bright future, and so I saw almost zero downside in going away to school, and I saw lots of upside, lots of options, if you will, associated with going away to school.
You've always been a tremendously motivated person and a hard worker and smart. When others in your age group were out having a good time and playing, you were working. Tell us about your first real job. I think it began in the third grade.
Um, yeah, the first sort of real paying job probably began in the third or fourth grade. We lived in an interesting neighborhood which was beginning to gentrify. We lived right across the street from a massive convent, and I was able to talk my way into getting a job sweeping the sidewalks in front of this convent. My first paying job was to sweep the sidewalks for the convent every Saturday morning.
Did that money-making job give you some insight into the fact that you would have this professional relationship with money? I mean, how important was money at that time?
Having that job really just gave me some extra spending money. We were among, even though we were an intact family and I had a father that was working, it felt to me as if we were among the poorest on the block. We didn't have any of the things that many of the other kids had. We didn't have bikes, we didn't have roller skates, we didn't have the real Chuck Taylor Converse All-Stars. We had the imitation Converse All-Stars. And so for me, working at that point in time was nothing more than to give me a chance to catch up, if you will, with some of the kids in the neighborhood.
You were the eldest of three. Do you feel that you had a lot to do with setting an example for your other siblings?
Our parents were very clear in setting sort of moral standards and making it very clear sort of what they expected of us, and we all sort of fell in line, if you will. I think, if anything, I may have sort of hurt my sister and brother by setting the bar so high that they had to sort of match that. But I certainly didn't consciously set out to set an example for them.
All right, you've left Richmond, you're now at Phillips Academy. There was a big difference in terms of the lifestyle that your classmates had compared to the lifestyle that you came from. Did those differences make a difference to you?
It's a very complicated question. What I would say is that at age 14, there are things that are obvious, there are differences that are obvious, but there are a lot of things that aren't different. First of all, it was an all-boys school, and all 14-year-old boys fundamentally are the same in that they're growing, that they are adventuresome. At Andover, they were all fairly smart. And during that period, 1970, you couldn't just look at an individual and determine their financial status because everybody looked like bums. And nobody cut their hair, nobody shaved. And in fact, you could almost argue that there was an inverse correlation between how somebody looked and sort of how well off they are. Most of the African American kids tried their best to look fairly presentable, and most of the wealthy kids, were rebelling and looked fairly unpresentable. I'd say that the differences were stark when it was time to go home for a long weekend. Those of us who were on full scholarship couldn't afford to go home, and so we stayed on campus. If you walked into somebody's room and you saw an incredible stereo system, then you realized that in fact they were a little bit different than you. But on the athletic playing fields, in the classrooms, Richmond, Virginia had really tried to implement the whole notion of separate but equal, which meant that they really invested in education for African American kids. We had brand new textbooks. We had the best teachers you could imagine. We started French in the fourth grade. And so getting to Andover didn't present much of a hardship or a transition, if you will, from an academic point of view. But obviously there were cultural issues. I hadn't really known any white kids. I hadn't known any Jewish kids, and so there were all kinds of transitions that I had to deal with coming to Andover.
But you were smart. I think you said you aced your French, your math, your science, your physics classes.
Yeah, I aced all of the courses where there were very clear rules of the road. So math, physics, science, if you will. What I didn't ace were the literature courses where you had to compare and contrast, and you had to talk about imagery, and you had to talk about metaphors, and that we really hadn't learned. Literature for us growing up had been basically reading stories and sort of having book reports, if you will.
I think you said you read Jack London's Call of the Wild,
Yeah.
and tell us about your experience with that particular piece of literature.
Well, the literature courses at Andover, and at Andover, each discipline has its own building. So all of the English courses were taught in Bullfinch, and Bullfinch Hall had a series of rooms, call it 10 feet by 30 feet, so fairly small rooms, and everybody sat around the room in sort of a circle, if you will. So you couldn't hide. So it was small, and you couldn't hide, and you discussed the various passages that you had read in a novel the night before, and then an exam would ask you to, compare this theme from this book to that theme in that book. In any event, our midterm was on Jack London's Call in the Wild. All I basically did was write a book report. There was a guy, there was a dog, it was snowing, they were in the woods, and that clearly was not what the teacher was looking for.
You didn't do any comparing or contrasting.
No.
Okay.
No.
And what was the teacher's take on your book report?
Well, the teacher, I remember him to this day, was a great guy. He was also the freshman basketball coach, and I was one of the stars on the freshman basketball team. And he just realized, okay, I've got to do some real teaching here. And that was also the beauty of the prep schools, in that all kids came to prep schools with some sort of deficiency. There were no perfect kids, and I could tell you story after story about any number of kids, wealthy kids, who had issues. And so my issue was I wasn't prepared for prep school level literature, and we worked on it. That teacher worked with me, and it took me actually a couple of years. It was really not until my junior year at Andover where I was proficient, and it came about in Shakespeare, where I finally, they were dissected, iambic pentameter. I mean, Shakespeare writes in nothing but iambic pentameter, and I finally got it all. But it took 2 years.
You made it through there, you graduated, and then you went to college. How did you make your choice about where you would attend?
In the 70s, the prep schools were really feeders to the elite schools. Andover had a tradition of sending kids to Yale, and Exeter had a tradition of sending kids to Harvard. You only applied to a handful. I applied to 7 schools, and 4 of those schools were Ivy League schools. And UPenn was my first choice. And I wanted to go to UPenn for a number of reasons. First of all, I played lacrosse, and UPenn was the only school that recruited me to play lacrosse. Secondly, a meaningful number of African American kids from Andover and other prep schools had chosen UPenn. UPenn seemed like the perfect mix of sort of getting away from an isolated place like the boarding schools and being in a city, but also being an Ivy League school. And so that was my first choice, but I also applied to Harvard and Princeton and Brown, and I got into all 4 of the Ivy League schools.
You were interested in the world of finance?
Not really. Not coming out of Andover. Really, not even throughout Harvard. I was interested in the world of economics, and I thought I would want to be a professor in economics. And so That's what I devoted most of my time to in college, studying economics, urban economics, labor economics, urban economics. I wrote a thesis on labor economics, and I thought that economics would be the way I would go, not finance.
In 1989, you learned that you would become the first African American and youngest individual to hold the title of managing director for Morgan Stanley. Did that surprise you that it went like that?
No. At some point in my senior year, I came to the realization that I wasn't ready to continue to go to school, and I applied sort of at the last minute to Harvard Business School and to Stanford, and with the realization that would only be 2 years of school as opposed to another 5 or 7 years getting a doctorate in economics. Then I realized that having spent 4 years in Andover and 4 years at Harvard, that I wanted to take a break. It was late in the process. Companies had basically come to campus and had completed their interviewing. There were only a couple of places that were still interviewing. Morgan Stanley was one of them. Procter & Gamble was one of them. There may have been a couple of others. And so I interviewed with Morgan Stanley, had no idea what investment banking was. It just wasn't, obviously, the rage that it became during the 80s and the 90s. But in any event, I got a job offer from Morgan Stanley, and I took it.
You really took it to the very top to reach the position that you did, a managing partner. That was big, wasn't it?
That was big. But I really enjoyed and still do enjoy investment banking. It was a natural fit for me. The demands of the profession meshed perfectly well with sort of my strengths, and you know, the rest is history. My parents were proud of everything that we did. It didn't really matter if I never saw any real distinction between their reaction to me bringing home a report card in the 5th grade with all A's, or me graduating cum laude from Harvard. They had high expectations. It didn't surprise them, and so I never really saw my mother or my father display any great sense of pride. I just knew that they were quietly proud of me.
I was very fascinated to find out that you were also a Better Chance intern. Tell me about that.
The summer after my freshman year at Harvard, I got a job working for A Better Chance, which was headquartered in Boston at the time. And I worked in the development office of A Better Chance. And so that was really my first exposure to not-for-profit fundraising.
You have a philosophy about competition. You speak also about yourself as a person who maximizes option value. What does that mean?
My view on competition, at least what I try to instill in my kids, is to compete in an aggressive but in a healthy way. And what I really mean by that is you absolutely leave nothing sort of on the table. You do your best. You do your absolute best. You have to convince yourself that you've done your absolute best, and you let the outcomes fall where they are. And so when I'm talking to my kids about their grades, and if they are dissatisfied with an outcome or what happened on a test, I ask, did you absolutely give it your all? Did you absolutely do your best? And a parent can look at a kid and know if that answer is reasonably close to the truth. And if I'm satisfied that they did, then I don't worry about competition. And that's the way I am in my pursuit of business. And Lazard is an amazing platform. Lazard has a great tradition of giving back, of getting involved. Our senior partner, Felix Royerton, in the 70s, sort of single-handedly saved New York City. And we've got a 165-year-old tradition on a global basis of doing more than just being involved in business. And so what I've been able to do from the Lazard platform is to continue to advise clients, but to get increasingly involved in not-for-profit activities, to get involved in political activities.
Talk to me about what it means to fail, because I know that there are people who are looking, who are watching her saying, God, I don't know if I can ever achieve that, or maybe I can achieve that, but what happens if I fail? What do you say about failure?
Everybody is going to fail. Said differently, I've never heard of, much less met anybody who has succeeded at everything that they set out to do. Failing means that you've set a really, really high bar for yourself, that you are out to try to accomplish as much as possible. If you haven't failed, then you haven't set the bar high enough. And so when you do fail, you step back and you see what you can learn from that process. And then you factor that into endeavors going forward.
What advice would you give finally to your fellow Better Chance young alumni who might be interested in a career in investment banking?
I was very, very lucky. And by the way, I haven't used that word, but luck is a key ingredient for any successful person. And if somebody tells you that they got to wherever they got totally on their own without any sort of external help or any environmental circumstance that went their way, then they're just wrong. So I got out of graduate school in 1982, which was really the start of the bull market. From the end of World War II through 1982, the stock market had probably fluctuated between 500 and 800 over that sort of 40-year period. It was nobody talked about the stock market. The stock market was never on the evening news. When I got out of graduate school in 1982, that was the beginning of a 25-year bull market. That had nothing to do with how hard I worked. I ended up being in the right place at the right time. Movies came out about Gordon Gekko. Tom Wolfe was writing about Masters of the Universe. That was an incredible period of time to be in finance and to be on Wall Street. Those days are gone. We're never going to have another 30-year period like that, certainly not in the next 100 years. And so people need to realize, and people are realizing, that that there are so many other exciting things to do to make a difference and to make money. Technology being at the top of that list. Silicon Valley, biotechnology, private equity, hedge funds. But investment banking is still a noble profession. But I do think that the best days of investment banking are, if not behind us, have certainly stabilized.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about your experience as a Better Chance scholar and an investment banker?
I'll simply say that that a Better Chance and Andover are the two foundational organizations sort of in my life. They go hand in hand. I couldn't be here without a Better Chance, and I couldn't be here without Andover. And I've stayed connected to both over 45 years now. A Better Chance is just an incredible investment. If I was going to try to link it to finance, if you will, I'd say that you can't get a better investment. And it's very simple math. I don't know what it is that a Better Chance spends today to recruit a kid and to ultimately place that kid. But I do know that it costs, at Andover, the tuition is probably $50,000 or $60,000 now. And so over 4 years, you're looking at $200,000 to $220,000 to go to school there. And so ABC spends, I don't know, $5,000 to find a kid and to place a kid, and then $200,000 is sort of provided in return, and then that kid goes on and becomes very, very gainfully employed and makes a major contribution. We've got the stats on our alumni, and we could tell endless stories about the contributions that they've made. So a better chance is a wonderful investment. I'd say the same thing about Andover.
Bill Lewis, thank you so much for being with us. Great advice, great story. We're glad that you were part of A Better Chance. And I want to thank you all for tuning in to Episode 4 of Virtually Speaking. I'm Doris McMillon, class of 1969, and I'm very grateful for a better chance.